At my husband's funeral, his father leaned in, smiling, and said the estate would now return to blood family. As if I were just a placeholder. As if 3 years of marriage, of building a life together, meant nothing. But what he didn't know is that Ethan left me everything. The land, the power, and the secrets buried deep in this family's roots. This isn't just a story about inheritance, it's about truth, betrayal, and the widow who refused to be erased. I don't remember much from the funeral, just the weight of my black veil pressing against my face and the trembling of my hands as I held the folded flag. My husband, Ethan, had always been the strong one, the shield between me and the world's harshness. But now, with the casket lowered and the final handful of dirt tossed by his father, Charles Whitmore, that shield was gone. People say grief makes you soft. That wasn't true for me. Grief sharpened me. Especially when I heard what Charles said right after the service. Now that Ethan's gone, he murmured behind me, hand on my shoulder like he was comforting me, the Whitmore estate reverts to blood family. That includes the vineyard, the beach house, the accounts. It's tradition. I froze. Not because I was shocked, no. I expected greed from Charles. What I didn't expect was the sheer gall of saying it at his son's grave. Before we go on, I just want to thank you for watching Karma Encrypted. If you enjoy stories of justice, revenge, and emotional comebacks, kindly consider subscribing to support this channel. Now back to the moment that changed everything. I turned to face Charles. His smile was polished, but I could see the edges crack. He expected me to cry, to beg, to crumble. I did none of those things. Instead, I simply said, "That's not what Ethan told me." His jaw twitched, but he quickly covered it with another pat on my shoulder. "You were his wife, dear, but only for 3 years. The estate's been in our family for generations. It's nothing personal, it's just how our family handles things." Nothing personal. Like my entire marriage was a rental agreement. Later that day, in Ethan's study, the one Charles had already started referring to as the library wing, I sat with a mug of untouched tea and stared at the wooden drawer Ethan never let anyone open. He used to joke about it, "If I ever die before you, babe, that drawer's your weapon. Use it wisely." I thought it was just dark humor. But I never forgot it. The key was taped under the desk drawer. Inside was a folder labeled "I in case they try anything" in Ethan's unmistakable handwriting. My breath hitched. My hands trembled. I opened it. What I found was a roadmap to the truth. Trust documents, ownership transfers, hidden clauses, video recordings, and a notarized letter signed 6 months ago, giving me complete and irrevocable ownership of the vineyard, the beach house, the luxury car collection, and all corporate interests. He knew. Ethan knew his father. And he protected me from beyond the grave. I clutched the documents like lifelines. Tears didn't fall this time, they were burned off by something hotter. Vengeance. The next morning, Charles showed up at the estate with a real estate attorney and a notary. "This will be quick," he said, walking in without even knocking. "Just need your signature to hand the property back to the family. You'll be generously compensated, of course." I smiled. "Before we do that, I'd like to show you something." I walked them to the grand dining room, the one Charles used to mock me for redecorating, and laid the folder on the table like a royal decree. He laughed, at first. Until he read the first page. Then the color drained from his face. "This isn't legal," he snapped. "The hell it isn't," I said. "Your son had a right to decide who inherits. And guess what? He chose me. Not his bloodline." The attorney looked between us awkwardly, then finally muttered, "This is solid. Irrevocable. She owns everything." Charles turned red. "You little widow," I cut in. "That's the word you're looking for. But you might want to update your vocabulary." I walked them to the door. "Oh, and Charles? Try anything shady, and I'll release the video Ethan left too. He detailed every financial misdeed you've ever committed under the family name." He blinked. I smiled. "Your move, Dad." That night, alone in the master bedroom Ethan and I once shared, I sat cross-legged on the bed and stared at the ceiling. I should have felt peace. But I didn't. Because the documents were just the beginning. I found more. Hidden USB drives. Passwords. A deeper web of secrets Ethan had uncovered, most of them not about me, or even about the inheritance. but about Charles. And about the Whitmore legacy itself. Apparently, Ethan had been gathering evidence for years. Evidence of money laundering, land theft, and shady dealings involving Charles and the board of the family corporation. Ethan had planned to go public, until the accident. And suddenly, I had to ask myself, was it really an accident? He was young, fit, no health conditions. Yet he'd collapsed alone in the vineyard one morning. The autopsy said heart failure. But Ethan didn't have a history of heart issues. Now I had reason to doubt everything. The timing, the silence, and Charles's eagerness to erase Ethan's final wishes. I wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. I was a woman holding secrets, dangerous ones. And I knew exactly what to do. I didn't just want justice anymore. I wanted the whole damn empire. For the first time in days, I woke up not with tears in my eyes, but with fire in my veins. I wasn't the same woman who wept silently through Ethan's eulogy. I wasn't the woman Charles expected to retreat to a modest condo with a generous payout and a mourning robe. I was his daughter-in-law, yes, but I was also now the majority shareholder of Whitmore Enterprises, and the legal owner of every inch of land he had schemed to take back. He wanted me gone. But I wasn't going anywhere. I spent the morning combing through Ethan's encrypted folders. The USB labeled for truth only was tucked in the lining of an old wine crate, because of course it was. My husband hid it right in the roots of the family business. Inside the folder were recordings. Dozens. Board meetings secretly taped. Financial audits cross-checked against what was publicly reported. Even footage of Charles in his office, laughing with a man I recognized, Harold Kessler, an old family friend, who conveniently ran the regulatory office for estate taxes in the county. Bleed it just slow enough she won't notice, Charles had chuckled in one file. She's pretty, but dumb. Like her mother. They were talking about me. They didn't know I had the master key now. I couldn't sleep that night. Not from grief, but from strategy. I sat in the center of Ethan's study, documents spread around me like a war map, planning the counterattack. The next morning, I made my first move. I summoned Harold Kessler for a friendly coffee at the estate. He came reluctantly, eyes darting around, probably wondering if he'd be followed. I offered him tea. He declined. I know about the adjusted tax assessments, I said plainly. His hands froze on the cup he wasn't drinking. Ethan recorded everything. Every bribe. Every waiver. Every fabricated document. He also kept copies of the original audits. You don't understand how this works, Harold stammered. This is bigger than just you. Exactly, I said, smiling. Which is why I'm giving you a choice. You go public with a resignation letter citing health reasons. Leave town. Quietly. Or I go to the IRS with a gift-wrapped set of files, your signature on every one of them. Harold didn't finish his sentence. He just nodded, stood, and walked out. One down. By that evening, word had already reached Charles. He called. I let it ring. Then I sent him a single text. Your first pawn fell. Your king's next. I wasn't just dismantling his empire. I was letting him watch it crumble, one piece at a time. That night, as rain tapped the windows like whispers, I pulled out the last of Ethan's letters. The handwriting was a little uneven. He must have written this one during one of his migraines, but it was still his. If you're reading this, it means I didn't survive long enough to fix what I uncovered. But I know you, Claire. You're smarter than they ever gave you credit for. Don't let grief steal your fire. Use it. Burn down every lie, every mask they wear. The family name doesn't deserve to be protected. You do. The truth does. And I love you, always. I whispered his name like a prayer, Ethan. I wasn't alone in this. Not really. The next morning, I went to the vineyard. It looked different now, less peaceful, more haunted. I walked the path Ethan had taken the morning he died. The gravel still held the outline of his boots, faded by time and wind. I stood in that same clearing where the workers found him collapsed under the olive trees. And I saw it. A tiny black security camera, half hidden under a stone lamp. One of the workers must have installed it as part of the estate's new smart vineyard plan Ethan had funded. And no one thought to check the footage. I ran back to the security room, heart pounding like thunder. The file was still there, time stamped for the morning Ethan died. I pressed play. The screen showed Ethan, holding a thermos, walking alone through the vineyard rows. Then another figure appeared. Charles. They were arguing. I couldn't hear the audio, there was none. But their body language said enough. Charles was shouting. Ethan stood his ground. Then Charles handed him the thermos. Ethan hesitated. He drank. Minutes later, Ethan clutched his chest. He staggered. And Charles walked away. Walked away. Ethan collapsed off-screen. I screamed. I screamed so loud I startled myself. And then I saved the footage to 3 hard drives and a cloud. This wasn't an inheritance dispute anymore. It was murder. I stared at Charles's smug photo on the wall of the estate, one of those legacy portraits he had commissioned in oil paint, hung in the gallery like royalty. The man killed his son for land. For power. And now he thought I would sit quietly and be generous with grief? No. I was going to destroy him. But I couldn't go to the police yet. Not with Charles's connections. He'd bought half the county. I needed more than just a single silent video. I needed a web. A collapse. And I knew just where to start, the board. The Whitmore family board was full of aging elites, friends of Charles, all drunk on power and tradition. They had voted to remove me once before Ethan stepped in. They'd buried the marriage as a trial phase, and blocked me from attending board meetings until Ethan changed the bylaws. Now I was the chairwoman. And I had video evidence. And Harold's files. I scheduled an emergency board meeting for the following Thursday. I knew Charles would show. He couldn't help himself. But what he didn't know. I had a secret guest speaker. And she was going to shatter everything. Her name was Ruth Delgado. Ethan's childhood nanny. Fired quietly by Charles a decade ago. But Ethan had tracked her down before he died. She had kept journals. About everything. She agreed to come. And she had one more surprise, something even I wasn't ready for. Apparently, Ethan wasn't Charles's biological son. The conference room had always been Charles Whitmore's temple. Long oak table. Burgundy leather chairs. A stained glass crest of the Whitmore family arms that filtered morning sunlight into royal hues. It was also the room where I was once told, months into my marriage, that wives aren't permitted to sit in during board strategy. A rule Charles enforced even when Ethan objected, until Ethan rewrote the bylaws and put my name into the succession plan. Now, I sat at the head of the table. Alone. Waiting. Every tick of the grandfather clock behind me sounded like a countdown to war. One by one, the board members filed in. Old men in tailored suits, cufflinks worth more than the average mortgage. Most of them raised their eyebrows when they saw me in the chair. She can't, began Mr. Alcott, the oldest, whose voice still trembled with age and entitlement. I can, I said without rising. And I will. Section 7B of the amended bylaws gives me emergency authority as majority stakeholder. Unless you'd like me to read it to you, line by line. He sank into his seat without a word. Charles walked in last. Of course. He always made an entrance. And this time, he brought a lawyer. Claire, he said, using my name like it was a smirk. This emergency meeting wasn't cleared by protocol. It was, I said, sliding a stamped approval onto the table. I followed every procedure. The lawyer leaned in, whispering something to Charles. He paled slightly but covered it with a grin. Then I suppose we're all ears. Let's hear why you dragged us in at 7 a.m. like school children. I stood. Gentlemen, I began, this isn't about grief. Or revenge. It's about the truth. Ethan tried to protect this family, and it cost him everything. I'm here to finish what he started. Charles laughed. What on earth does that mean? I hit play on the screen. The projector flickered to life. And the vineyard footage began. Gasps rippled around the table. Ethan. The thermos. The argument. Charles walking away. Silent. Damning. The lawyer's face drained of color. We need to pause this. Sit down, I snapped. You'll get your turn. Charles stood, face beet red. This is manipulated. Out of context. Then explain it, I said. Explain why your son drank something from you, then collapsed. And why you walked away. Silence. I'll tell you why, I said. Because you wanted me out. You wanted Ethan out of the way. So you could revert the estate back to the bloodline. Charles's eyes narrowed. The estate was never yours to begin with. And that, I said, turning toward the door, is the other reason we're here. I opened it. And Ruth Delgado walked in. Elderly but regal, with a scarf tied under her chin and a spine stiffened by truth. Charles's eyes went wide. You? You have no business. Sit, I said. And he did. Ruth stood at the end of the table, clutching her small leather-bound journal. I cared for Ethan since he was 4 weeks old, she said softly. I stayed with him until he was 8. That's when Mr. Whitmore asked me to leave. I never told anyone why, until now. She opened the journal, shaking but determined. Ethan was not your son, Charles. Gasps again. Charles slammed his fist on the table. Lies. No, Ruth said, lifting a yellowed photo from her bag. Truth. This is a photo of Ethan's birth certificate. I made a copy before you destroyed the original. His biological father was a man named Martin Feldman. Your wife had an affair. She never told you, until Ethan's eyes started to look nothing like yours. I felt the air shift. I found the medical files in Ethan's private vault, I added. He found them too. That's why he was digging into your estate holdings. He knew your claim to the legacy was built on a lie. I raised him, Charles barked. I fed him, paid for his schools. And he repaid you with loyalty, I shot back. Until you poisoned him. Charles stepped forward, hands shaking. This board won't believe you. You're an outsider. You mean the woman your son legally married, whose name is now on every deed and share? I asked. I turned to the board. Every one of you has remained silent while this man embezzled money from our holdings, fabricated permits, and stole land from indigenous farmers under the Whitmore name. I have the files. So did Ethan. I threw them on the table. He was going to clean this up. But now it's up to me. The room was silent. Until Mr. Olcott cleared his throat. What are you proposing? A vote, I said. To remove Charles Whitmore from all executive functions effective immediately. And to begin a full forensic audit of the Whitmore Foundation, its subsidiaries, and all related offshore accounts. You don't have the votes, Charles said, trembling. I have the power, I said, meeting each board member's eyes. But I want your vote, not your obedience. One by one, hands rose. 8, 9, 10. Majority. Charles's face collapsed. You can't do this, he whispered. Actually, I said, I just did. The lawyer gathered his papers, already moving toward the exit. Ruth left behind her journal. And Charles just stood there. Still. Hollow. I'll fight you, he muttered. I stepped close, so only he could hear. You already lost. That afternoon, I stood alone in the vineyard again. But this time, I wasn't mourning. I was reclaiming. I ran my fingers through the vines Ethan planted himself. I knew I had a long way to go, rebuilding the company, restoring its integrity, tracing every lie Charles buried like rotten seed. But for the first time in weeks, I saw the sun through the stained glass. And I didn't flinch. Victory has a strange silence to it. After the board vote, Charles vanished from public view. No press conferences. No statements. Just one short resignation email, sent through legal counsel. The kind of quiet that usually means something is brewing. I didn't trust it. But I couldn't afford to slow down. Not now. The next 2 weeks were a blur. I officially took the title of CEO at Whitmore Enterprises. Employees, many of whom had only seen me as Ethan's wife, now greeted me with cautious respect. Others looked at me with quiet resentment, probably planted by Charles during his long reign of intimidation. I didn't care. I wasn't there to be liked. I was there to rebuild. The first thing I did was open the vault. Ethan's vault. He'd stored it beneath the wine cellar, hidden behind a false wall of dusty Bordeaux. Inside were hard drives, maps, copies of contracts in multiple languages, and one thin folder, marked simply, the real numbers. I opened it and found something I didn't expect. Money. Lots of it. Hundreds of thousands unaccounted for. But here's the twist, it wasn't missing. It had been redirected to a ghost company that funneled through several shell corporations. And the name attached? Avery Benson. My assistant. Avery had been with me since before Ethan died. She was the one who brought me tea during the funeral. She booked my appointments, read my moods like a second skin, and stayed late organizing Ethan's memorial. She was my shadow. And now I had to wonder if she'd been Charles's spy the whole time. I called her into my office. Calm voice. Polished smile. Avery, I said, I need you to help me verify some ledger discrepancies. She leaned in. Of course. I handed her the ghost company profile. Do you recognize this? She froze. Not a flinch, not a blink. But her voice dropped half a pitch. No, ma'am. Should I? I smiled. Probably not. But just in case, cross-reference these transaction IDs with our Q4 expenditures and prepare a report by tomorrow morning. Absolutely, she said. But I knew she wouldn't. Because the second she left my office, I had security monitor her every move. At 3:13 p.m., Avery entered the server room. At 3:17 p.m., she tried to delete a batch of files. At 3:18 p.m., her access was revoked, and security escorted her from the premises. I confronted her myself in the courtyard, under the olive tree Ethan had planted during our first anniversary. Why? I asked. Why him? Avery didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just said, because he promised me everything you have. Charles. Of course. He'd recruited her to siphon company funds years ago. Then convinced her that when Ethan was gone, she'd get to be the next Mrs. Whitmore. He poisoned Ethan, didn't he? I asked. She didn't answer. I didn't need her to. I pressed charges that afternoon. The police were hesitant at first. After all, it was white-collar crime, and Avery was a respected face in the city. Until I gave them the footage of the vineyard. And the documents she tried to wipe. They took her away in cuffs. And yet, something still didn't feel right. Because Avery wasn't smart enough to design the whole laundering scheme. She was a pawn. A well-placed, well-rewarded pawn. I dug deeper. And what I found next cracked everything open. There was one more account. Hidden even from the ghost company web. It was connected to a non-profit foundation Charles had started years ago to fund scholarships for underprivileged children. Only this non-profit didn't fund anything. It funneled money straight into a trust in the Cayman Islands. Under the name of Jordan Whitmore. My jaw clenched. Jordan was Charles's nephew. Ethan's younger cousin. A failure of a businessman with a taste for expensive watches and fast cars. He'd been missing from the family scene for years. Last I heard, he was bankrupt and living abroad. Apparently, not anymore. He'd been laundering money through the non-profit with Avery's help, and he was next in line for Charles's hidden empire. So Charles wasn't just trying to reclaim power. He was trying to pass it on. To someone just as corrupt. I stared at the documents for a long time, heart pounding. The pieces finally fit. Charles hadn't acted out of grief. He acted out of succession. He wanted to erase Ethan's legacy, discredit me, and funnel everything back into his bloodline, starting with Jordan. But Ethan saw it coming. He'd mapped it all out. And he trusted me to finish it. I called my attorney Julia, an old friend of Ethan's who owed him more favors than she'd ever admit. We need a federal investigation, I said. I'm done playing defense. I'll call the Justice Department, she replied. Then, I did something I never thought I'd do. I visited Charles. He was staying at a private estate miles outside the city. A place Ethan had once jokingly called the Lair. The butler hesitated when I arrived. I walked past him. Charles was in the garden, pruning roses like he had no skeletons in the closet. You destroyed your son, I said. And now your little empire's collapsing. He looked up, unfazed. Ethan was weak. No, I said. He was kind. There's a difference. You think this is over, he said with a bitter laugh. You think you've won? I know I have. I dropped the Cayman account printout on the table between us. He didn't even blink. I'll drag you and Jordan to court. I'll expose every illegal transfer, every lie you told. I'll bury your name. Charles stood. Slow. Deliberate. You should have stayed a widow, he said, venom dripping from his voice. Now you'll be a target. I already was, I whispered. You missed. I turned and walked away. Because the war was over. Now came the reckoning. The subpoenas landed like thunderclaps. Charles, Jordan, and Avery, each one officially under federal investigation. Wire fraud. Tax evasion. Racketeering. The whole tapestry was unraveling faster than they could lie. I watched the news from Ethan's old office, now fully mine. Headlines flashed across the screen. Whitmore dynasty under investigation. Widow CEO triggers corporate cleanse. Secret recording ties family patriarch to poisoning scandal? I didn't speak. I didn't blink. I just breathed, slow, measured breaths that came not from victory, but from survival. Because I was still standing. After everything. Charles hadn't spoken publicly, but his lawyer made the rounds, pushing vague denials and waving around claims of defamation by a grieving widow. Grieving widow. They kept calling me that. But they were wrong. I wasn't grieving anymore. I was evolving. The Justice Department was moving faster than I expected. Julia, my attorney, said the files Ethan left behind were so airtight that even the prosecutors were surprised. You've done half the work for them, she said on the call. Honestly, Claire, you're the reason this thing might actually end in prison time. I didn't feel proud. I felt hollow. Because none of it would bring Ethan back. The world praised my strength, my poise, my strategy, but they didn't know what it felt like to lay beside an empty pillow every night, to smell his cologne on shirts I couldn't bring myself to donate, to open his old texts just to remember how he wrote my name. Justice wasn't peace. But it was something close. That night, as I sat by the fireplace with one of Ethan's favorite vintage scotches, my phone buzzed with a new message. A number I didn't recognize. Just a link. And one sentence. Ethan said you'd know when it was time to see this. My heart stopped. I clicked. A private video loaded. One I hadn't found on any of the drives. It was Ethan, sitting at his desk in the vineyard study. The light was dim, his eyes tired, but clear. Hey Claire. If you're watching this, then Charles did what I always feared he would. And I'm so sorry I couldn't stop him. But you always saw through people. I know you probably already uncovered the money trail, the non-profit, maybe even Jordan. But there's one more thing you need to know. My spine stiffened. This estate, the Whitmore Vineyard, it's not just a winery. It's a vault. And I don't mean the cellar. I mean the land itself. Back in the 1800s, the Whitmores built their fortune not from wine, but from land theft and illegal slave labor. I found the original deeds, hidden under the chapel foundation near the Southern Grove. I froze. Charles has buried more than just bad contracts. He's buried the truth about how this family got rich. And he knows the moment that gets out, the entire legacy collapses. It's not about money. It's about erasure. He thinks if he outlives the past, it won't matter. Ethan leaned forward in the frame. But it does. You matter. This truth matters. Find the box, Claire. And when you do, don't bury it again. Burn down the lie. The video ended. I sat there in stunned silence. And then I ran. Out the back of the estate, through the midnight wind, down to the old chapel at the edge of the vineyard, the one Ethan always insisted we keep for aesthetic value. I'd never questioned why it sat empty. I never noticed the faint scent of damp wood and iron. I opened the creaky side door. Dust and silence greeted me. I stepped to the altar, pushed aside the rug, and pried up the old floorboard. There it was. A blackened metal box, locked and sealed. I carried it back up to the house with shaking hands. Inside were yellowed deeds, handwritten ledgers, signed letters detailing the Whitmore family's original acquisitions, all forged, all soaked in blood. Names of families displaced. Payments made to corrupt officials. Photos. Horrific photos. Men in chains. Children picking grapes in ragged clothes. Whitmore wine, built on the backs of the enslaved. The truth. Ethan had known. And he didn't want this empire unless it could be rebuilt with integrity. And now it was mine. But what would I do with it? If I made it public, the brand would collapse. Thousands of workers would lose jobs. Investors would pull out. Decades of reputation would rot overnight. But if I stayed silent, I'd be Charles in different skin. I poured another glass of scotch and stared at the fire. Then I made my decision. The next morning, I called a press conference. Charles didn't show. He sent his lawyer. I walked up to the podium, box in hand. "My name is Claire Whitmore," I said. "And today, I am not here as a CEO. I'm here as the wife of a man who died trying to tell the truth. And as the woman who now holds the truth in her hands." Flashes popped. Reporters stilled. I opened the box. These are the original documents tied to the founding of Whitmore Enterprises. Many of them were hidden beneath a structure on the family estate for over a century. What they reveal is not just uncomfortable, it's criminal. Gasps. I continued. "My husband believed we can't build a future without first facing the truth about the past. I believe that too. And so today, I'm initiating a full independent audit of our historical practices. We will fund reparations. We will rename brands built on injustice. And we will no longer run from the truth." One reporter called out, "Won't that destroy the Whitmore name?" I smiled softly. "I hope so." That night, I walked through the vineyard under a silver moon. I heard Ethan's voice in my head. "Burn down the lie." I didn't need the Whitmore name. I had my own. Claire Ashford Whitmore. The woman who refused to disappear. 3 months later, the Whitmore name no longer stood for wine, wealth, or prestige. It stood for truth. It stood for reckoning. It stood for me. The national headlines had shifted tone over time. The same media that once marveled at the Whitmore family's elegant dynasty now used phrases like historic exposure, blood-built fortune, and the widow who wouldn't back down. The old vineyard signs came down. In their place, newly carved ones bore a new name. Ashford Estate. Named after my own family, the one Ethan always said I should never hide behind his. It was poetic. And it was just. The employees didn't revolt as I feared. In fact, they rallied. For the first time, the workers saw a face in charge who wasn't wearing entitlement like a second skin. I held town halls. Listened. Reinstated those who'd been unfairly laid off by Charles's cost-cutting schemes. And I announced a profit-sharing model for all vineyard employees moving forward. Ethan would have loved that. As for the board, those who stood by me now formed the foundation of a cleaner, leaner executive team. Those who opposed transparency quietly resigned. Some louder than others. Charles, for instance. He tried everything to stop the storm. Filed a countersuit. Released interviews calling me unstable. Claimed Ethan was manipulated by me in his final days. But the evidence crushed every attempt. The IRS had begun auditing his accounts, and federal prosecutors were building a case around wire fraud, embezzlement, and suspected foul play in Ethan's death. They even reopened the autopsy. And what they found was damning. Traces of digitalis, a powerful plant toxin often used in cardiac treatments, but lethal in high doses, had been overlooked in Ethan's toxicology screen. It was enough to trigger an arrest warrant. Charles Whitmore, family patriarch, was indicted. He never made it to trial. 2 days before his hearing, he fled the country. Disappeared off the grid. Interpol is still looking for him. But I know he's watching. I hope he sees everything he tried to erase now standing stronger than ever. As for Jordan, his fake nonprofit was exposed and shut down. His overseas accounts frozen. He returned to the U.S. under a plea deal and is now facing 5 years of prison time with mandatory restitution. Avery took a shorter sentence in exchange for full cooperation. Funny how quickly loyalty collapses under the weight of prison walls. But that wasn't the end of the story. Not for me. One rainy afternoon, I walked the vineyard paths again. The sky was silver, the air heavy with spring. And in the very place where Ethan took his final steps, I stopped and sat beneath the olive tree. I thought I was alone. Until Ruth Delgado joined me, her cane clicking softly against the stone. "He'd be proud of you," she said, settling beside me. "I don't feel victorious," I admitted. "Just exhausted." "That's what real change feels like," she whispered. "It takes pieces of you. But what it leaves behind, that's legacy." We sat in silence, the kind that only truth can grant. Then she handed me a small envelope. I found this, she said, tucked into one of the books Ethan left for me. Said it was for Claire's new beginning. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a deed to a small piece of land in Tuscany, and a handwritten note. You always said you wanted to make your own wine. Something with lavender in the soil. Something bold. Just like you. If you're reading this, go build it. The real legacy. Not under my name. Under yours. You were never just my wife, Claire. You were always the future. I cried. Not because I was broken, but because I was finally healing. I left for Tuscany 2 months later. The land was small. Wild. Half covered in sagebrush and stubborn roots. But it had promise. And it had a view that made the soul hush. I didn't bring much. Just a journal. And a name. Vigna di Verita, Vineyard of Truth. It felt right. A new beginning. Not to escape Ethan, but to honor him. The first bottles rolled out 2 years later. Small batch. Hand-labeled. They sold out in weeks. Not because of the wine, though it was good, but because of the story behind it. People wanted to taste what truth felt like. Now, every time I walk those rows, I think of the woman I used to be. The woman who stood behind a man she adored. The woman who was told property reverts to blood. The woman they thought would walk away. But I didn't walk. I built. From the ashes. From the betrayal. From the lies. Because I am not a footnote in a dynasty. I am the author of a new one. And in every glass they raise in my vineyard, every woman who sees my name on a label, every story whispered about the widow who fought back, I hope they remember one thing. You can bury a man, but not the truth he died to protect. And not the woman he loved enough to trust with it.